Tune into Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on Nice Radio for A View from the Outside.
This society needs a spectacle. It might help us to see some people.
On A View from the Outside this week, we look at PLAN, P-L-A-N, PLAN, with the view being that as St Vincent and the Grenadines reels from one crisis to the next, it has become imperative to ask questions of the regime in the country regarding their plan, or lack thereof perhaps, for rebuilding the country. The Oxford Dictionary defines plan as a detailed proposal for doing or achieving something. That definition tells us that to plan is to have details of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. To plan is to put things in place to minimize failure and to ensure success. To plan is to set out how you're going to achieve or accomplish something. Many commentators, including us here on A View from the Outside, have over time described the regime in St Vincent and the Grenadines as one that continues to do things on an ad hoc or piecemeal and oftentimes haphazard basis. As a result, they have been accused of lacking genuine concern for the people of the country. The recent occurrences, including dengue fever, the pandemic COVID-19, the eruption of the volcano La Soufrière, and most recently, the floods from the rains, have served to expose the unpreparedness and seeming lack of having a plan on the part of the regime, which is why serious questions have to be asked of them. Within recent times, the country was plagued with dengue fever, which wreaked havoc everywhere. Many people, including school children, died as a result of having fallen victims to the disease. Many people were stunned that in this day and age, there was such a serious outbreak of dengue fever in the country. Many people were stunned even more when people started dying after having contracted the disease. The outbreak of dengue fever has exposed the haphazardness of the regime. It transpired that they did not heed the warnings from the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPHA, of an imminent outbreak of the disease. It also came to light that all of the precautions necessary, including fogging and educational awareness of the population to help to eradicate the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which causes dengue fever, were ignored by the regime. What is clear is that they appeared to have had no plan concerning combating the outbreak, and it seemed that only after many deaths and nearly 2,000 infected that they started to scramble around for a solution. Dengue fever still remains a threat to the people of St Vincent and the Grenadines. The failure of the regime pertaining to combating dengue fever is one which has left Vincentians reeling and trying to pick up the pieces. Right on the heels of dengue fever came COVID-19, the pandemic which continues to cause death and destruction in many countries around the world, including India, which is currently undergoing an uncontrollable surge of the disease. To date, COVID-19 is presently responsible for more than 152 million infections and more than 3.2 million deaths around the world. This deadly disease has been handled abysmally by the regime, particularly in the early stages of the disease. They appeared clueless, as if they had no plan as to how to combat this deadly disease. It seemed as if the only spokesperson on everything is the head of the regime, the one who parades as if he is omniscient. He's often accused of stifling the life out of the public servants and professionals, thus preventing them from doing their jobs. One would remember how he behaved in terms of the observance of the most basic protocols which were approved by the World Health Organization. It took the leader of the opposition, the Honorable Dr. Godwin Friday, to lead the way. He exemplified to the nation how to observe those protocols. One would remember also the head of the regime's negative pronouncements about wearing gloves and wearing masks, and about observing social or physical distancing, including the number of people that could attend a funeral. His treatment of the Vincentian sailors who were stranded aboard cruise ships and his alleged demands for money from the cruise liners is now a matter of record for the historians and the history books. His unwillingness to close the borders of the country has oftentimes been blamed for the dramatic increase in the number of COVID-19 cases in the country. COVID-19 is still real. It has not gone away. And the way things have unfolded surrounding the issue of the taking of vaccination for the disease leave a lot to be desired. Subsequent to the outbreak and seeming mismanagement of COVID-19, St Vincent and the Grenadines has been hit with another crisis, that of the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano. Again, the seeming cluelessness of the regime has been laid bare. In the opinion of many experts and others, the volcano gave those in authority ample warning and ample opportunities to put things in place, to devise a plan to timeously and orderly evacuate people from the disaster zones. The volcano was in an effusive state of eruption for months, and the experts knew and stated publicly that it was going to erupt explosively, and it did. Sadly, the regime seemed ill-prepared for the moment when the explosive eruption eventually came. Many have asked serious questions about why the evacuation order was delayed for so long and why it was given as late as it was. When that moment eventually came, there seemed to be little or no plan in place to deal with the mayhem which followed. It was unbelievable that at the 9th hour, the National Disaster Management Organization, NEMO, was putting out notices for van drivers, operators, and owners to register as transportation to transport evacuees from the danger zone. People at the northernmost end of the country were left stranded, and it had to take the Herculean efforts of private citizens to ensure that their fellow Vincentian colleagues were safely evacuated. Most, if not all, of the evacuation centers were reported to be unprepared to house evacuees. They were lacking in basic necessities, including cots, mattresses, blankets, and water. The regime has failed the people miserably. They tried to use the disaster of the erupting volcano to compel citizens, especially the evacuees, into taking the COVID-19 vaccine. Their policy of forced vaccination was announced by one of their ministers of government, when he told the desperate evacuees that were boarding a ship in Chateaubriand that in order to access a government-run facility, vaccination was mandatory. The head of the regime himself announced that some governments, as well as the management of cruise liners, required evacuees to be vaccinated prior to using their facility. They even had some of the managers of evacuation centers or shelters telling evacuees that if they took the COVID-19 vaccine, they would be transferred from centers to hotels. When this shameful and despicable policy was exposed to the world, and when there was international criticism and condemnation of such a policy, they set their wheels in motion to try to retreat from that position. They failed the people. They failed the people miserably. Also, the crisis has exposed the nakedness of the regime and the dire financial position which the country finds itself in, even prior to the disasters. Although the explosive eruptions have lessened, La Soufrière remains a threat, and that threat is compounded by the flood waters from the torrential rainfall, which has caused extensive damage. Those disasters have no doubt exposed the regime for having very little or no plan to deal with what befalls the country. They appear to be stumbling from one phase to the next. While the hard questions must be asked about the regime's lack of planning in relation to the natural disasters, serious questions also have to be asked about what is or what was their real plan for Prime, where the perception of millions of dollars were handed out mainly to party hacks and supporters, seemingly to garner votes in the last general elections. Where is the accountability for the Prime project? Those questions must be asked. Questions have to be asked too about their plan for having built the medical complex in the danger zone in Georgetown, a facility which is now currently rendered completely useless as a result of the eruption of La Soufrière. One would remember that they ignored the warnings for putting such an important facility in the danger zone. What was their plan for trying to force teachers back to school in the middle of a pandemic into facilities which were totally ill-equipped to ensure the safety of all? What was the plan for trying to use draconian measures to get teachers and others to take the COVID-19 vaccine? What was the plan pertaining to the environmental impact of the now failed geothermal project, a project which many say is probably linked to the current disaster happening at La Soufrière? Questions have to be asked also about the regime's plan to deprive poor people of the relief supplies sent to them by relatives and other donors from overseas. Why does the regime want to continue to dispossess the poor, the extremely poor in the country? Is the plan to seize this opportunity to continue to use poverty as a weapon on the people? All those are questions which must be asked of the regime, and the Vincentian people must demand that they answer them. Well, as the regime continue to stumble and their failures exposed from one phase to the next, the financial, social, and moral fabric of the country are taking a battering. The poor, those in extreme poverty, and the dispossessed become even more demoralized. And whilst all of that is happening. Those in the absolute minority in the country continue to thrive and even shamelessly hijacked the limelight during a time of crisis and disasters to announce to the world their opulence and how much of mogul they have become. It is for Vincentians to ensure that the hard questions are not only asked of the regime, but to put pressure to bear on them to ensure that they put a plan in place to rebuild St Vincent and the Grenadines for the betterment of all. They must have a plan, because if they don't, failure will most certainly continue. And embodied in any such plan must be details of how they intend to go about providing accountability to the Vincentian people, accountability which they have avoided over all these years. They must be made to account for the millions of dollars in financial and other aid that is pouring into the country at this time. It is for every Vincentian to remind the regime of the words of the famous 19th century Spanish painter Pablo Ruiz Picasso, who said, and I quote, "Our goals can be reached through a vehicle of a plan. There is no other route to success," unquote. I'll repeat that. Our goals can only be reached through a vehicle of a plan. There is no other route to success, unquote. Until next week, Justin and all of the listeners, this is Brereton Horne with A View from the Outside, with a reminder to send your feedback, as usual, to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. We also invite you to visit and like our Facebook page at A View from the Outside, and also to subscribe to our YouTube channel at JMB Horne. Have a pleasant Saturday, a wonderful Sunday, and a productive week ahead, with plan being the watchword. All the best to you, Justin, and the listeners.